Lehman Brothers survived the American Civil War. It survived the railroad crashes of the 1800s. It survived two world wars. It survived the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed. It survived the oil shocks, the crash of 1987, the dot-com bust, and the attacks of September 11th, which happened 3 blocks from its own headquarters. For 158 years, this firm outlasted every disaster America could throw at it. And then, over the course of a single weekend in September 2008, it died. By Monday morning, 25,000 people had lost their jobs. $613 billion in debt was left behind, the largest bankruptcy in the history of the United States. Bigger than Enron and WorldCom combined, multiplied by 6. And within days, the global financial system was so close to total shutdown that the men running it, the Treasury Secretary, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, were privately telling each other that if they didn't act, there might not be an economy on Monday. Here's what makes it so hard to look away. Lehman didn't die because of a war, or a natural disaster, or some once-in-a-millennium black swan. It died because it made a bet that American house prices would never fall. And it made that bet with borrowed money, around $30 of debt for every $1 it actually owned. That's not investing. That's standing on a skyscraper ledge with your eyes closed, betting the wind won't blow. This is the story of how the 4th largest investment bank in America turned itself into a time bomb, why the US government let it explode when it had saved everyone else, and why, 18 years later, we are still living in the wreckage. Welcome back to Capital and Ruin, the channel where we follow the money through history, the fortunes, the frauds, the bubbles, and the spectacular collapses that shape the world you live in. Last time we went back 400 years to a company that conquered an empire. Today we're looking at something much closer to home. Something that probably touched your parents' savings, your neighborhood, maybe your own life. But to understand how Lehman fell, you have to understand how impossibly far it had climbed. Because this story doesn't start on Wall Street. It starts in a dusty general store in Alabama. In 1844, a young German immigrant named Henry Lehman stepped off a boat from Bavaria and made his way south to Montgomery, Alabama. He opened a small dry goods store, selling tools, seeds, fabric, whatever the local farmers needed. His 2 brothers, Emmanuel and Mayer, followed him across the Atlantic. And in 1850, the 3 of them put their name over the door, Lehman Brothers. Now, here's where it gets interesting and where the financial story really begins. The farmers around Montgomery were cash poor. They didn't have money, but they had cotton, so they started paying the Lehmans in raw cotton instead of dollars. And the brothers realized something. The cotton was worth more than the goods they were selling. Cotton was the oil of the 19th century, America's single biggest export, the raw material feeding the textile mills of Britain and New England. And the Lehmans had accidentally stumbled into the middle of that trade. So they stopped being shopkeepers and became cotton traders. Then cotton brokers. Then they moved to New York, the financial center, and helped found the New York Cotton Exchange. And that's the pattern that defines this entire company for a century and a half. Lehman Brothers were never the biggest. They were the adapters. Cotton became commodities. Commodities became railroads. Railroads became underwriting, helping companies like Sears and Woolworths raise money by selling shares to the public. Then came investment banking. Then bond trading. Whatever the money was doing, Lehman followed it. There's an uncomfortable truth in the early history here, and it's worth naming honestly. The Lehman's fortune was built on cotton in the antebellum American South, an economy powered by slave labor. The family were slave owners themselves. The wealth that founded Wall Street's Lehman Brothers has that at its root. The firm survived the Civil War that destroyed the economy it was born in. It survived 1929. In the 1980s, it was swallowed by American Express, then spat back out in 1994 as an independent, publicly traded company. Smaller and hungrier than its rivals. And at that moment, a new man took the wheel. A man who would run Lehman Brothers for the next 14 years. And drive it straight off a cliff. His name was Dick Fuld. On Wall Street, they called him the Gorilla. Fuld was a traitor to his bones. Intense, combative, famously intimidating. He'd worked at Lehman since the 1960s, and when the firm was cut loose in 1994, he became its CEO. He would go on to be the longest-serving CEO on Wall Street. And by most measures, he was brilliant at it. Under Fuld, Lehman went from an unloved spin-off to a giant. Its stock soared. Profits hit records year after year. In 2007, the firm reported its best year ever. But Fuld was haunted by one thing. Lehman was the smallest of the big Wall Street banks. Number 4. Always looking up at Goldman Sachs, at Morgan Stanley, at Merrill Lynch, and he was determined to close that gap. The question was, how do you make a small bank grow fast? The answer Wall Street gave, and this is the beating heart of the whole crisis, was leverage. Let me explain leverage, because if you understand this, you understand 2008. Imagine you have $100,000, and you buy a house with it. If the house goes up 10%, you make $10,000. Nice. Now imagine instead you use that $100,000 as a deposit, and you borrow $3 million to buy a much bigger property. If it goes up 10%, you make $300,000. You've tripled your original money. You're a genius. But if that property falls just 3%, you've lost $90,000. Almost everything you had, and you still owe the $3 million. That is leverage. It multiplies your gains, and it multiplies your losses just as violently. By 2007, Lehman Brothers was running a leverage ratio of roughly 30-1. For every dollar of its own capital, it held about $30 of assets bought with borrowed money. At that ratio, a fall of just 3-4% in the value of its assets would wipe out its entire equity. The whole firm. Gone. And what were they buying with all that borrowed money? Houses, or rather, pieces of paper that represented houses. To understand what Lehman was holding, you need to understand the machine that Wall Street had built. And it's simpler than they want you to think. Step 1. A family in Ohio or Florida or Nevada takes out a mortgage to buy a house. Step 2. A bank buys thousands of those mortgages and bundles them together into one big package. That package is called a mortgage-backed security. You buy a slice of it, and you get a slice of everyone's monthly mortgage payments. It's a bond made of homeowners. Step 3. The logic was that this was safe. Sure, one family might default, but thousands of families spread across the whole country? They'd never all default at once. American house prices had never fallen nationwide since the Great Depression. The rating agencies looked at this logic and stamped huge chunks of these bundles, AAA. The same rating as U.S. government debt, the safest thing on earth. And so the world bought them. Pension funds, city councils, foreign banks, everybody wanted the yield. Step 4 is where it rots. Because Wall Street's appetite for these mortgages became infinite. The banks needed more mortgages to bundle, and America was running out of credit-worthy people who wanted to buy a house. So the standards collapsed. Enter the subprime mortgage. Loans to borrowers with poor credit, no savings, sometimes no verified income at all. Loans with teaser rates that would explode 2 years later. In the industry, they had a nickname for the worst of them. Ninja loans. No income, no job, no assets. Loans handed to people with no realistic ability to repay them because the lender wasn't planning to hold the loan anyway. They'd sell it to Wall Street within weeks. If it blew up, it was someone else's problem. The entire chain of responsibility had been severed. The person who made the loan didn't care if it was repaid, and the person who ended up owning it didn't know what was in the package. Now, Lehman didn't just buy into this. Lehman went further than almost anyone. Lehman bought up the mortgage lenders themselves. Subprime originators like BNC Mortgage and Aurora Loan Services. This meant they controlled the whole pipeline. They made the risky loans. They bundled the risky loans. And they sold the risky loans. By 2007, Lehman had become the largest underwriter of mortgage-backed securities on Wall Street. They called it vertical integration. It was a factory. And it was extraordinarily profitable, right up until the raw material turned toxic. And then, in 2006 and 2007, the thing everyone said could never happen, happened. American house prices started to fall, the teaser rates reset. The subprime borrowers couldn't pay. Defaults began to climb. And every one of those AAA-rated bundles, the safest thing on earth, started to look like exactly what it was. A bag of bad loans wearing a very expensive suit. Most of Wall Street began quietly backing away from the mortgage market in 2007. Lehman did the opposite. Lehman doubled down. In 2007, with the cracks already showing, Lehman went on an aggressive push into commercial real estate, including a roughly $22 billion buyout of the apartment giant Archstone at the absolute peak of the market. Fuld's view was that this was a dip to be bought, not a collapse to be feared. It was, in hindsight, one of the worst-timed deals in modern financial history. By early 2008, the market had figured out what was coming. In March, Bear Stearns, the fifth largest investment bank, a firm loaded with the same toxic mortgage assets, hit a wall. Its lenders lost confidence and stopped lending to it. Within days, a firm that had existed for 85 years was dead. It was sold to J.P. Chase for a fraction of its former value, with the Federal Reserve stepping in to backstop the deal. And every trader on Wall Street looked at Bear's collapse and asked the same question. Who's next? The answer, everyone agreed, was Lehman. Lehman's stock began to slide. Short sellers circled. And Dick Fuld went to war, publicly insisting the firm was solid, blaming the short sellers, refusing to accept how bad it was. But behind the confidence, Lehman was doing something else. Something that would only come to light years later. An accounting maneuver known internally as Repo 105. In simple terms, right before each quarter ended, Lehman would temporarily shuffle tens of billions of dollars of assets off its balance sheet, classifying a short-term loan as a sale, so that when it published its results, its leverage looked far healthier than it really was. Then, days later, the assets came right back on. This was uncovered by court-appointed examiner Anton Valukas in his 2010 report into the bankruptcy, which found the firm had used it to move roughly $50 billion off the books at quarter end. They weren't just holding a burning building. They were repainting the front door before the inspectors arrived. Meanwhile, Fuld was desperately trying to find a rescuer. He courted the Korea Development Bank. Talks collapsed. He tried to raise capital. He tried to spin off the bad assets. Every door closed. And then came the weekend. Friday, September 12, 2008. Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, New York Fed President Tim Geithner, and SEC Chief Christopher Cox summoned the heads of every major Wall Street bank to the Federal Reserve Building in Lower Manhattan. The message was blunt. Lehman Brothers will not survive the weekend. There will be no government money. You, the banks in this room, are going to solve this yourselves. Two buyers emerged, Bank of America and Britain's Barclays. And over about 72 hours, both of them slipped away. Bank of America looked at Lehman's books, saw the scale of the hole, and walked, going instead for Merrill Lynch, which, sensing the guillotine, sold itself over that same weekend to save its own life. That left Barclays. And Barclays actually wanted the deal. But there was a catch. To buy Lehman, Barclays needed to guarantee its trading obligations, and under British rules that required a shareholder vote, which would take weeks. Lehman had hours. Barclays asked the British regulators to waive the requirement. The British authorities refused. They were unwilling to let a British bank take on the unquantified risk of a collapsing American firm without shareholder approval. The American side later summarized the British position in the most famous line of the entire weekend as a refusal to import our cancer. The last buyer was gone. Paulson and Bernanke held the line. No bailout. Publicly, they argued Lehman was different from Bear Stearns, that the market had had 6 months to prepare, that they lacked the legal authority to lend against Lehman's rotten collateral, and that endlessly rescuing reckless banks would only guarantee more recklessness. The problem of moral hazard. Whether that was principle or miscalculation is still argued about today. At around 1:45 in the morning, on Monday, September 15, 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The filing listed roughly $639 billion in assets and $613 billion in debts. It remains by an enormous margin the largest bankruptcy filing in United States history. The next morning, the world watched the employees of 745 7th Avenue walk out of the front doors, carrying their careers in cardboard boxes. Here's the thing Paulson and Bernanke got wrong. They thought Lehman was a firm. It wasn't. It was a node. Lehman sat at the center of a web of trades, loans, and contracts with virtually every other financial institution on the planet. When it died, nobody knew who was owed what, who was exposed, or who would be next. And in a panic, uncertainty is more dangerous than loss. The result was not a crash. It was a seizure. The day Lehman filed, the Dow Jones fell over 500 points, its worst single day since the September 11th attacks. But the truly terrifying damage was invisible to the public. The market for short-term lending between banks essentially froze. Banks stopped trusting each other enough to lend overnight. And when banks stop lending to each other, the entire machine that funds normal companies, payroll, inventory, everything, starts grinding to a halt. One day later, a money market fund called the Reserve Primary Fund, which held Lehman debt, announced its shares were worth less than $1. This is called breaking the buck, and money market funds were supposed to be as safe as cash. Ordinary savers panicked and began pulling their money out en masse. That is the moment the crisis reached beyond Wall Street and touched everyone. Within 24 hours of Lehman's collapse, the U.S. government, the same government that had just refused to save Lehman, had to seize the insurance giant AIG with an $85 billion emergency rescue. Because AIG had insured huge swaths of these mortgage bets, and its failure would have detonated everything. The no more bailouts principle lasted roughly 1 day. Within weeks, Congress passed a $700 billion rescue program. Governments across Europe were nationalizing banks. Iceland's entire banking system collapsed, and the world fell into the deepest recession since the 1930s. In the aftermath, an estimated 8.7 million Americans lost their jobs. Millions lost their homes to foreclosure. Household wealth evaporated on a scale not seen in generations. The people who paid the price for Lehman's leverage were, overwhelmingly, people who had never heard of Lehman. And what happened to the men who built it? Richard Fuld earned somewhere close to $500 million in compensation over his years running Lehman. In a congressional hearing in October 2008, Representative Henry Waxman confronted him with the arithmetic that his company was bankrupt and the economy was in crisis, and yet Fuld got to keep the money. Fuld disputed the figures and maintained the collapse was caused by market forces and a crisis of confidence, not by his decisions. No senior executive of Lehman Brothers ever went to prison for the collapse. In fact, across the entire 2008 financial crisis in the United States, essentially no top Wall Street executive was jailed for their role in it. The firm's American operations were bought by Barclays days after the bankruptcy for a fraction of what the firm had been worth. So what do we actually take from this? It's tempting to make it a story about villains, about one arrogant man who wouldn't sell in time. And Fuld does carry enormous responsibility. But Lehman wasn't an aberration. Lehman was the most extreme expression of what everyone was already doing. The leverage, the subprime pipeline, the AAA fantasy, the accounting sleight of hand. Lehman just took it furthest, and so it broke first. If it hadn't been Lehman, it would have been someone else. Bear Stearns nearly beat them to it. Merrill Lynch sold itself in the same weekend to avoid the identical fate. The real machinery of ruin here is the one we've seen on this channel again and again. Borrowed money. A story everyone believes, this time that house prices never fall. A system where the people making the bets don't carry the losses. And a chain of institutions so interconnected that one failure becomes everybody's failure. Regular viewers might feel a chill of recognition. Because we've told this story before, 400 years earlier. A company that levered itself into ruin and had to be rescued to save the wider economy. The East India Company. Different century. Identical anatomy. The tools that build fortunes are always the same tools that destroy them. Leverage doesn't have a moral compass. It just multiplies whatever you point it at. Lehman Brothers survived 158 years of history. It could not survive its own balance sheet. If you made it this far, thank you. You're exactly the kind of person this channel is built for. If you got something out of this one, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who care about how the money actually works. And if you want more stories like this, the bubbles, the empires, the frauds, and the beautiful disasters that built the world we live in, subscribe to Capital and Ruin, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Next time, we're going into the tulip that costs more than a house. I'm Bjorn. This has been Capital and Ruin. Watch the money. Because it always leads somewhere.